1941, you'll perhaps recall that the war was well on, and England was more than occupied with the Battle for Britain. Japs had come into the war, and the Yanks weren't yet in the war, and the Japs started to advance south at that point in time, about the end of 1941. They were coming south pretty fast. And somewhere about middle of November 41, two British battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, were sunk by Japanese dive bombers right off the east coast of Malaya. And this was a horrifying thing because those battleships were all that stood between Australia and the Japs. Anyway, I came to work that morning fairly early, and my boss was a fellow named Fred David, a bit bloke, and he came into work that morning early too, and we'd both horrified by the news we just heard about these battleships being sunk. He was so upset that he was sitting at his desk, which was close to mine, and he was weeping. So I walked over and sat on a stool next to him and tried to console him a bit, talk to him a bit, and waited for him to dry his tears, which he did after a time. I think I shed a few tears myself. Anyway, after quite a few minutes, he turned to me and said, "Design a fighter." Well, that was the beginning of the Boomerang. And at that point, of course, we got all the draftsmen and everybody we needed into the team, and we designed and built that Boomerang, putting it straight into production without a prototype, 5 coming down the line, and we did it in something just over 5 months. I'm not quite sure what the time was, but it was extraordinarily fast. And, well, she flew, and we built 250 of them.
The privately owned Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, known as CAC, was incorporated in Melbourne on the 17th of October 1936. During the late 1930s, political events in Europe and elsewhere made it clear to some that another world war was a distinct possibility. With concerns about Australia's industrial potential, events were set in motion which eventually led to the formation of the CAC. 3 companies were originally involved: BHP, Broken Hill Smelters and GMH. And a decision was made to purchase 30 acres at Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne, where the CAC factory was built and ready for occupation in September 1937. Under licensing agreements with the USA and an agreement the CAC could modify the designs to meet RAAF requirements, the CAC's first aircraft to be produced was the Wirraway, generally regarded as an advanced training aircraft. Due to time limitations and the urgency of the project, the Boomerang incorporated as many of the design features of the Wirraway as possible, including the landing gear, wing center section and fuselage, as these parts were already in manufacture in the CAC factory.
First pictures of the Boomerang, Australia's new interceptor. She was designed and built in this country, and the men swarming around her did the job. This is her test flight made some time ago. Release of these pictures has been delayed for obvious security reasons. The Boomerangs are in operation in the north today, so the story can be told. There's plenty of excitement among the factory workers as she roars down the runway. After all, she's their baby, and from the way she rolls about the sky, she's a mighty precocious baby, too. Back to Earth for a perfect landing. The test pilot pronounced her tops a grand machine, and the boys who built her really let themselves go.
With the promise of superior designs and high-performance aeroplanes once the war was over, the Boomerangs, which had survived, could offer little to the RAAF, and the last flights of the Boomerang occurred in late 1946. The first and only Boomerang since the war to reappear in Australian skies is Guido Zoccoli's CA-19 Boomerang, which was rebuilt around the frame of number 206 off the production line and used a collection of original parts. original plane was delivered to the RAAF for service in June 1944 and was then transferred to 83 Squadron where it stayed. When the war ended, it was delivered to Oakey in Queensland for scrapping. Guido's aircraft, A46-206, was originally built as a model CA-19, the last Boomerang variant of which a total of 49 were produced. A great deal of time and effort has been spent over the last 20 years or so by a handful of people devoted to rebuilding a Boomerang to flying stage. Matthew Denning is one such devotee, and he recently had the opportunity to accompany one of the original test pilots, Greg Board, when he was reintroduced to the Boomerang aircraft after 50 years.
Should know where the control column lock is.
Like all new aircraft, the Boomerang was subjected to exhaustive testing by the CAC and RAAF before entering service.
They called for applicants for test pilot's job down there, which I applied for. And I flew a Boomerang down there for my interview. But that was we went to change tanks and the handle came off. Right. And I ran out of fuel and in the tank that I was on, had to make a forced landing. It was a rough old paddock, and there were trees at the ends, and I'd completely lost the engine. It was a dead stick landing. Right. So I dropped in across the trees and landed rather heavily. And got away with the landing, it was all right. And the fellow on a motorbike came by with a spanner,
right,
which his little toolkit. So we turned the shaft around and got the fuel flowing again and the engine running.
Must have been quite a shock for him to see a war plane.
Yeah, he was quite surprised to see an airplane sitting there. Yeah. And continued on down to CAC and had the interview, and they repaired the fuel thing. They were very little embarrassed about it, naturally. Sure. And I went back to Mildura, and when I put the airplane in the hangar and they checked it out, they found that I'd sprung a few rivets in the heavy landing, getting it in there, which they had to repair. Right. And so that was my introduction, really, to Boomerangs.
So how many would you have actually flown whilst a test pilot at CAC?
Over 200 of them went through that I tested. And
including
probably
this particular one?
Including 206, this one. Yes, that was well on the way.
And that was about June 44, wasn't it?
It was about that period, yeah.
Test pilot Gregory Board, fighter pilot of the RAAF, on loan to the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. Pilot Board 22 is a great flyer, and is about to put a new Boomerang through her paces. Not very long ago, Australia was practically without aircraft defense. The government called on Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation for help, and under the supervision of Wing Commander L.J. Wackett, the Boomerang was evolved and in production in the shortest time in aeronautical history. Already she's won her spurs in New Guinea. Board, youngest test pilot in the world, is about to give her the gun. Stand by for action. Straight into the sky, hanging on her prop. Boomerang can execute operations only limited by the pilot's ability to take the punishment of fast maneuvering. Board is an outstanding flyer, and while still under 20, was shot down by a Zero in the Singapore debacle. He indulges in a little unorthodox flying, just to show how the Boomerang can perform. No, the camera doesn't lie. She's upside down. The pilot, of course, is strapped in. And remember, he's doing that in the slipstream of the camera plane. Enough of that? Right, let's go. She's very fast, but makes no claims to the super speed class. Her maneuverability is unexcelled. She's coming up. The Boomerang always comes back, even if for the moment the pilot is throwing her for a loop. Obviously, the Boomerang's the real thing, and this remarkable demonstration of her flying qualities is something for those Australian detractors of Australian industry to paste in their collective hats. Rolling home, and how? Said a 9th Division Brigadier at Finschhaven, nowhere have we had aerial cooperation to compare with what we got from the Boomerang squadrons. Yes, Boomerang's got what it takes.
But it's nice to sit in one again after all these years.
Yeah.
They're a lovely airplane to fly. But it wasn't a satisfactory airplane for combat. It was slow, it was aerobatic, but it was slow.
Yeah.
It wasn't as maneuverable as a Zero.
No.
And I flew the Brewster Buffaloes against the Zeros. And they had no hope. We were just shot down one after the other with those things. And this had about the same performance as the Brewster Buffalo. Very similar airplane.
It was only a stopgap measure, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Try and get aeroplanes in the air.
Yeah. He was a good trainer for a fighter pilot before you popped him into something else.
But all in all, it was a fairly stable aeroplane, I think, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Nice handling.
Oh, yes. Very, very delightful airplane. Well designed. And you thank a man called Mr. David.
Fred David.
Fred David,
Yeah.
who put all his experience into this and got it from the day it was thought about till the day that the first one flew was 6 months. And I think that's pretty much a world
It's an
record.
incredible effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The restoration process is long and arduous and begins with the fuselage section. This is also the part where identification of the original aircraft can be made if the certification plate is still intact. The cockpit section, rear fuselage, centre section and tail group were all bolted together on the original frame to facilitate easy repair. The way these parts were replaced or repaired during service often makes it difficult to identify a particular airframe. Matthew Denning and Greg Batts have set up a workshop in Brisbane where they pool their knowledge and resources, and both have found the restoration process can be hindered by time and financial restraints. The task of rebuilding is often also compounded by the fact that the CAC had discarded virtually all of the original Boomerang drawings after the Second World War. The handful of people undertaking restoration work together, exchange and loan parts to overcome these problems. Restorers of the Boomerang have travelled extensively throughout Australia to collect discarded parts and then restore them back to their original condition, which can often be difficult when the parts have been exposed to the elements for over 40 years. Matthew originally intended to restore his plane to static or non-flying condition, but has since decided to work alongside Greg Batts to restore both planes in the workshop to flying condition. This has meant restoring parts to a higher standard so that the aircraft will withstand the rigours of flying. The wings in particular have created problems for the restorers, as a complete usable wing section could not be found. The rarity and uncertainty of Boomerang parts can be directly related to its history when the war ended.
At the end of World War II, a lot of the aircraft in the Air Force started to be pensioned off, and 83 Squadron had to shed a few Boomerangs as well. So in about 1945, January through to April, a number of Boomerangs were ferried through to Oakey, just outside of Toowoomba in Queensland. There was about 36 Boomerangs that finally ended up at Oakey, which was an Air Force storage depot, and they just sat there in the grass. And by about 1948, the war was well and truly over. These aeroplanes were obsolete, and the order came through to dispose of them. So a lot of the cannons and armament were removed, the instruments came out, the engines disappeared, and the aircraft were sold off just as hulks to the highest bidder for scrap. And so the scrap metal merchants decided to cut through the bolts that held the wing to the fuselage. The whole wing just went into the smelter as one piece of aluminium. All the tailplanes were removed with oxyacetylene torches just burning through the tubes, and all that just went into the smelter as well. Any slag that wasn't aluminium just came off out of the bottom of the furnace. And so what was left was just a lot of